A night in the camp at Kenophrurium in Thrace, the year 275 AD. The air is thick and cold, smelling of the damp wool of cloaks, the smoke from dying fires, and the ozone freshness of a coming storm. Inside the imperial tent, in a circle of flickering light from an oil lamp, sits a man. His name is Eros, and he is the emperor's personal secretary, his notary. His hand, usually firm and swift, tracing flawless Latin letters, now trembles as he dips a reed pen into an inkwell. Before him lies a papyrus, and on this papyrus he is writing a list of names, the names of the army's highest-ranking officers, the most trusted commanders. But this is not a list for commendation. It is a death warrant, and it is a forgery. Eros knows that the emperor, Lucius Domitius Aurelian, the man who in 5 years pulled the Roman Empire from its grave, the man nicknamed Restorer of the World, is merciless toward any mistake, any hint of incompetence or corruption. And Eros has made a mistake, a petty lie, and now his exposure is only a matter of time. A single thought pounds in his head. Aurelian's anger doesn't mean a reprimand or exile. It means a swift and ruthless death. And so, in this tent, at the heart of the most powerful army in the world, a small, desperate lie is born. A list of men the emperor has supposedly ordered to be executed. It was the only defense a terrified clerk could devise against absolute power. He doesn't yet know that this scrap of papyrus, this trembling calligraphy of fear, will become the most effective weapon against the man who could not be defeated by Gothic hordes, Palmyrene cataphracts, or Gallic legions. Here, in the quiet of the night, the central paradox of this entire story is born. How could the greatest savior of Rome, a man of titanic will and unbreakable power, fall victim to such a petty, pathetic deception? How did a system built on iron discipline and fear create the conditions for its own self-destruction, turning a small lie into the catalyst for a titan's fall? To understand the depth of this fall, one must descend into the hell that was the Roman Empire in the mid-3rd century AD. It was an era that went down in history as the crisis of the 3rd century, and that name doesn't even begin to convey the horror of what was happening. Imagine not just a state in decline, but an entire world falling apart, like the shattered eagle, the symbol of Rome, plummeting from the sky. In the West, in Gaul, Britain, and Spain, a separate Gallic Empire had emerged, ruled by a succession of usurpers, minting its own coins and fighting its own wars. In the East, from the shimmering sands of Arabia, rose the Palmyrene Empire, led by the legendary Queen Zenobia, who had seized Egypt, the breadbasket of the entire Mediterranean and all of Asia Minor from Rome. What remained of the central authority in Rome was like a bloody torso without arms or legs. But external enemies were only one head of the Hydra. Across the Danube and Rhine frontiers, hordes of barbarians poured as if through a broken dam. Goths, Vandals, Alemanni, Juthungi, Sarmatians. They reached Italy itself, burning cities that hadn't seen an enemy for hundreds of years. The economy collapsed into a chasm of hyperinflation. The silver denarius became a copper coin, merely washed with silver, rendering it almost worthless. The empire was ravaged by the plague of Cyprian, a pandemic that claimed thousands of lives a day and devastated entire regions. But the most terrible affliction was the political gangrene. In 50 years, more than 26 so-called soldier emperors rose and fell, and almost all of them were murdered by their own troops. The army, once the bedrock of the state, had become its executioner, proclaiming and overthrowing emperors for the sake of a pay raise. Rome was no longer a wolf. It was an old, wounded carcass being torn to pieces by both external predators and internal parasites. It was a real-time apocalypse, a world where the very concept of the Roman Empire seemed an empty sound, a relic of a glorious past. It was into this darkness, this hopelessness, that a man had to come who could not just halt the fall, but turn back history itself. This man did not come from the aristocratic salons of Rome, nor from the hereditary senatorial families whose names were carved on the forum. He was the flesh and blood of the land that served as the empire's bloody frontier. Lucius Domitius Aurelian was born around the year 214 near the city of Sirmium, in the province of Pannonia, in modern-day Serbia. This was the limes, the border, a wild, untamed land where life was cheap and peace was just a brief respite between wars. His parents, according to ancient historians, were humble peasants, perhaps tenant farmers renting land from a local senator. He was not raised on the poetry of Virgil and the speeches of Cicero. His lullabies were the cries of war horns. His horizon was the endless Danubian steppe, and his alphabet was the heavy Roman sword, the gladius. He belonged to the type of men later called the Illyrian emperors, men from the Balkan provinces, grim, battle-hardened warriors for whom the army was the only path to advancement and the only true homeland. In their veins ran not blue blood, but the harsh, pragmatic energy of men who know that survival depends solely on the strength of your arm and the sharpness of your blade. This environment forged his character. He was devoid of aristocratic softness and political flexibility. He saw the world in black and white. There was order and there was chaos. There was loyalty and there was betrayal. There was Rome and there were its enemies. He didn't know how to weave intrigues in the Senate, but he knew how to read a map and predict the movement of barbarian cavalry. His hands were made not to hold a stylus, but to grip the hilt of a sword. This background, on one hand, gave him incredible resilience and an understanding of the army. On the other, it deprived him of the ability to compromise and play the subtle game of politics, a failing that would ultimately seal his fate. He was not a politician on the throne, but war itself made emperor. In an atmosphere of total despair, when it seemed the gods had turned their backs on Rome, society desperately searched for omens, clinging to any glimmer of hope. Ancient prophecies, especially the cryptic and ambiguous Sibylline books, regained their popularity. These sacred texts, which the Romans consulted in their darkest hours, were rumored to predict both great calamities and the coming of a savior. Priests and oracles throughout the empire interpreted the signs: the flight of birds, bolts of lightning, the entrails of sacrificial animals, and their vague pronouncements increasingly hinted at the arrival of a man from the Danube, a warrior who would restore unity and bring back a golden age. Aurelian's name, then just one of many talented commanders, began to be shrouded in legend. Stories were told that on the day of his birth, a purple stone was found in an eagle's nest, or that a priest in the temple of Apollo had foretold his mother that she would bear not a mere man, but a son for Rome. Of course, many of these tales were likely fabricated later by his own official propaganda to legitimize a commoner on the throne, but they reflected a deep-seated public need for a miracle. The figure of Aurelian fit this mythological template perfectly. He was a man from nowhere, a self-made man whose rise could be explained by nothing short of divine providence. Later, as emperor, he would actively cultivate this image himself, establishing a single-state cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, subtly suggesting that he, Aurelian, was the earthly embodiment of this deity, its chosen agent, bringing light into the darkness. This aura of being the chosen one, the man of destiny, gave him immense authority on one hand, but on the other, it isolated him. placing him on a pedestal from which the simple human fears and motives of those at its base were invisible. He believed in his mission, and this belief made him great, but it also made him blind to the small, human lie that was festering at his feet. Aurelian's path to the pinnacle of power was paved with the bodies of Rome's enemies and forged in the fire of ceaseless battles. His youth and maturity were spent not in libraries, but in military camps on the most dangerous stretches of the frontier. He enlisted as a common legionary and rose through every rank of the military hierarchy, from centurion to commander of the cavalry. Every position, every battle, was a lesson in the only science he valued, the science of victory. He fought the Goths in the Balkans, the Franks in Gaul, the Sarmatians in Pannonia. He saw how the incompetence of commanders led to the annihilation of entire legions, how corruption in the supply lines weakened the army more than any enemy, and how the indecisiveness of politicians in Rome nullified victories won with blood on the frontiers. These years forged in him an absolute faith in three principles: speed, discipline, and ruthlessness. He understood that in the total war the empire was waging, delay was tantamount to death, and mercy toward an enemy or one's own negligent soldier was a betrayal of those who fought conscientiously. Ancient authors, such as the Historia Augusta, are filled with stories of his severity. He might order a soldier executed for stealing a single grape from a local, claiming that discipline starts small. He introduced the harshest punishments in the army, including decimation, the execution of every 10th man by lot, and demanded the impossible from his men, but he was always at the forefront, in the thick of the fight, setting an example of personal courage. This model of behavior, demanding absolute efficiency and punishing the slightest offense, worked on the battlefield. It created the most effective army of its time. But he saw no difference between managing a legion and managing an empire, between a soldier and a civil servant. He transferred this model of total control and zero tolerance for error to his court, creating an atmosphere where fear became the primary tool of governance. And it was this very atmosphere, this forge of his character, that would ultimately forge the dagger that ended his life. Aurelian's star truly began to rise during the reign of Emperor Gallienus, one of the most underrated rulers of the 3rd century crisis. Gallienus, unlike many of his predecessors and successors, understood that the old system of army command was failing. He initiated a military reform, creating a mobile cavalry corps, a kind of fire brigade that could be rapidly deployed to the most threatened sectors of the front. At the head of this new elite force, he placed the best commanders he could find, and among them was Aurelian. It was here, as commander of the cavalry, that Aurelian honed his tactics of lightning strikes and flanking maneuvers. He played a key role in crushing the Gothic usurper Aureolus near Milan, where he first proved himself a strategist of the highest order. His reputation grew with every battle. The soldiers adored him for his bravery and his generosity with spoils, but at the same time, they were terrified of his wrath. After the assassination of Gallienus and the short but glorious reign of Claudius the II Gothicus, who died of the plague, the troops stationed on the Danube did not hesitate for a second. They proclaimed Aurelian emperor. This was not just another military coup. It was a conscious choice by the army in favor of the only man they believed could save the world. His first blood as a commander and his first taste of supreme power had shown him that victory is achieved not only with the sword, but by creating a legend around one's name. He cultivated the image of an invincible, harsh, but just leader. And when he finally donned the purple toga of an emperor, he was no longer just a general. He was a living myth, the last hope of a dying empire. This aura of infallibility and strength attracted loyal supporters, but it also repelled others, creating a distance between him and ordinary people, a distance that would ultimately be filled by the deadly whisper of fear and lies. What truly motivated this Illyrian peasant who ascended to the throne of the Caesars? Was it the simple lust for power common to many usurpers of that era? An analysis of his actions reveals a motivation that was far deeper and more complex. Aurelian was possessed by an idea, an almost religious dogma, the idea of Roma Eterna, eternal Rome. Having grown up on the frontier, he saw Rome not just as a city or a state, but as the sole force separating civilization from barbarian chaos, order from total annihilation. Looking at the corrupt senators, the inept emperors, the rebellious generals, he felt not just political disagreement, but a deep personal offense. To him, their actions were sacrilege, a betrayal of Rome's sacred mission. His cruelty and ruthlessness stemmed not from sadism, but from the conviction that he was a surgeon called upon to excise the cancerous tumor that afflicted the body of the empire. Anyone who stood in his way, be it a separatist, a barbarian, or a negligent official, was not just an enemy to him, but a heretic encroaching on a sacred trust. This fanatical devotion to an idea was both his inner demon and his greatest strength. It gave him the energy to accomplish in 5 years what others could not have done in 50. To crush all enemies, reunite the fractured provinces, and implement reforms. But this same obsession made him inflexible and blind. He could not understand that other people might be guided not by grand ideas, but by simple, earthly feelings. Fear, greed, the desire to survive. He judged everyone by his own standard, demanding from them the same superhuman devotion to the cause. He created a system where the slightest error was seen as a betrayal of the great work. And he could not imagine that in this very system, built on fanatical faith and all-consuming fear, the most insignificant human vice, the cowardice of one small man, would prove stronger than all his grand designs. His sacred fury purified the empire, but it also consumed him. Barely had he secured his throne when Aurelian faced a threat that made Rome itself tremble. The Juthungi and Alemanni tribes, having breached the Danubian frontier, invaded northern Italy, and, after crushing a Roman army at Placentia, marched directly on the defenseless capital. For the first time in almost 600 years, an enemy stood at the gates of the Eternal City. Panic gripped Rome. Aurelian, however, did not yield to despair. Displaying miraculous speed, he regrouped his forces, caught the barbarians near the Metaurus River, the very same place where Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, had once been defeated, and in 3 bloody battles, completely annihilated them. But this crisis exposed a terrible truth. The heart of the empire was vulnerable. Realizing this, Aurelian made a decision that would forever change the face of Rome and become an eternal monument to his reign. He initiated the construction of gigantic defensive walls around the city, known today as the Aurelian Walls. It was a monumental undertaking, 19 kilometers long, 6 meters high, with towers every 30 meters. The construction of these walls was not just a military act, but a psychological one. It was a silent admission that the Golden Age, when the might of the legions was Rome's best defense, was over. Now the city that ruled the world needed walls itself, like any frontier fort. The Aurelian walls became a symbol of a new era, an era of defense, an era of fear. They saved Rome from plunder, but they also enclosed it in a stone ring that became the physical embodiment of the besieged mentality that pervaded the empire. Aurelian, in saving the city physically, inadvertently highlighted its weakness. The irony was that while erecting these impregnable walls against external foes, He remained completely defenseless against the threat festering within his own headquarters, where no walls or towers could protect him from the most destructive weapon of all, human fear. Having crushed the barbarians in Italy, Aurelian turned his gaze to the east, where his most formidable and exotic adversary awaited. The kingdom of Palmyra, once a loyal Roman ally on the Persian border, had transformed into a powerful empire stretching from Egypt to Asia Minor. Ruling this empire was a woman of exceptional beauty, intelligence, and ambition, Queen Zenobia. She called herself a descendant of Cleopatra and made no secret of her intention to create a new Eastern Hellenistic power capable of challenging Rome itself. Palmyra was not just a rebellious province, it was the wealthiest center of caravan trade, possessing a powerful army whose core was its heavy cavalry. The cataphracts, fully armored riders and horses, the true tanks of antiquity. For Aurelian, the campaign against Zenobia was not merely a war for territory. It was a clash of civilizations, a confrontation between Roman order and Eastern opulence and separatism. He understood that without Egypt, which supplied most of its grain, Rome was doomed to starvation, and without Asia Minor, the empire would lose crucial recruitment and tax bases. The entire year of 272 was marked by this epic confrontation. Aurelian, at the head of his battle-hardened Danubian army, swept through Asia Minor, reclaiming it for Rome, city by city. Zenobia, confident in the strength of her army and the impregnability of her capital, awaited him on the Syrian plains. She was not just a rebel, she was an alternative center of power, and her existence challenged the very idea of a single, indivisible Roman Empire. Aurelian had to prove that there could be only one sun in the world, and it shone from Rome. The battle for the East was becoming the decisive test for the restorer of the world. The decisive battles of this Eastern campaign became a masterclass in military art and a demonstration of Aurelian's genius as a commander. The first major clash occurred near the city of Emai, not far from Antioch. Zenobia and her top general, Zabdas, deployed their main force against the Romans, the invincible Palmyrene cataphracts and light cavalry. Aurelian, whose infantry was exhausted from a long march and whose cavalry was outnumbered, employed a stratagem that would enter the annals of military history. He ordered his light Dalmatian and Moorish cavalry to charge, and then feign a panicked retreat. The Palmyrenes, confident of an easy victory, gave chase. The Roman horsemen lured them for many kilometers under the scorching Syrian sun. The heavy armor of the cataphracts, effective in a short engagement, turned into roasting ovens. When both men and horses were utterly exhausted by the heat and the long pursuit, the Roman cavalry suddenly wheeled around and delivered a devastating blow. Simultaneously, fresh Roman infantry joined the fray, completing the rout. This same tactic, with some variations, was repeated in an even larger battle at Emesa. Aurelian again used a feigned retreat to disrupt the enemy's ranks and neutralize their main advantage: the power of a unified armored charge. He demonstrated the key quality of a great commander, the ability to turn his weaknesses into strengths and use the enemy's strengths against them. He did not try to smash the Palmyrene armored fist head-on. He exhausted it, deceived it, and destroyed it. These victories were not just a triumph of Roman arms. They were a triumph of Roman discipline and tactical thinking over Eastern overconfidence. Zenobia, having lost her field army, was forced to flee and lock herself in her luxurious capital, the city of Palmyra, trusting in the strength of its walls. But Aurelian had already proven that his mind was sharper than any sword, and his will harder than any stone. The siege of Palmyra, the bride of the desert, became the climax of the Eastern campaign. The city, surrounded by powerful walls and situated in the middle of a vast desert, seemed impregnable. Zenobia rejected all offers of surrender, hoping for aid from the Persians and that the Roman army would simply break under the hardships of a desert siege. But she underestimated Aurelian's tenacity. He organized flawless logistics, supplying his army with water and food via caravans, and completely blockaded the city. Realizing that no help was coming, Zenobia attempted to flee to Persia on a camel, but was captured by a Roman patrol. With the queen's capture, Palmyra surrendered. And here, Aurelian showed unexpected mercy. He did not destroy the beautiful city, but merely stationed a small garrison there, and, taking the treasures and the captive queen, headed back to Europe. However, as soon as his legions departed, the people of Palmyra, incited by Zenobia's supporters, rebelled and slaughtered the Roman garrison. Aurelian's reaction was immediate and terrifying. He turned his army around and, returning to Palmyra by forced march, took the city by storm. This time there was no mercy. The city was given over to plunder and destruction. Aurelian wrote to the Senate, "You must spare no one. Slay the old, kill the children. Spare neither man nor woman." This episode vividly illustrates the duality of his nature. He could be pragmatic and merciful when it served his purposes, but his fury was boundless when he felt betrayed. The destruction of Palmyra became a grim warning to all others. The restorer of the world restores order, not with persuasion, but with iron and blood. This lesson was well learned throughout the empire, and especially within his own circle. People understood that with this emperor, there were no second chances and no room for error. Having reclaimed the east, Aurelian immediately turned to the west to gather the last fragment of the shattered empire. The Gallic Empire, which had existed for nearly 15 years, was in its death throes. Its last ruler, Tetricus, was a weak aristocrat, unable to control his own troops. His army was vast, but undisciplined. In the year 274, the two greatest armies of the Roman world met on the Catalonian plains, near the modern city of Châlons-en-Champagne in France, the very place where Attila the Hun would be stopped 2 centuries later. The battle could have been one of the bloodiest in Rome's history of civil wars, but something strange happened. Ancient sources, particularly Eutropius and the Historia Augusta, report that Tetricus, weary of power and afraid of his own soldiers, entered into secret negotiations with Aurelian. He deliberately arranged his troops in an unfavorable formation, and, at the very beginning of the battle, along with his son, simply defected to Aurelian's side, leaving his army leaderless. The Gallic legions, betrayed by their leader, nevertheless fought with desperate courage, and the battle turned into a terrible slaughter. But without leadership, their resistance was broken. The Gallic Empire ceased to exist. The reunification of the West, unlike the bloody Eastern campaign, was the result not so much of military genius as of a secret deal and betrayal. Aurelian achieved his goal, but it was not a clean victory. He had shown that he was willing to use not only force, but also intrigue to get what he wanted. He spared Tetricus's life and even gave him an honorary position in Italy, an act of unheard-of mercy by the standards of the era. But for everyone else, it was another lesson. The emperor valued results above all else and was willing to ally with yesterday's enemies if it served the great cause of restoring Rome. The empire was whole again. Aurelian's mission, it seemed, was complete. In 274, after returning from the West, Aurelian celebrated a triumph in Rome that, according to contemporaries, surpassed anything the Eternal City had seen since the days of Pompey and Caesar. It was not just a military procession, but a grand political spectacle designed to demonstrate to the world that the empire had not only survived, but had been reborn from the ashes. The procession was dazzling, immeasurable treasures captured in Palmyra, exotic animals from the east, 20 elephants, and 200 wild beasts were paraded through the streets of Rome. Representatives of all the defeated peoples marched in the procession: Goths, Vandals, Alemanni, Franks, Sarmatians, Egyptians. But the main spectacle was the captive monarchs. At the front, in golden chains, walked the once proud Queen Zenobia, so laden with jewels that she could barely move. Behind her, in Gallic trousers and a purple mantle, walked Tetricus and his son. This was the peak of Aurelian's power. He had done the impossible. In less than 5 years, he had crushed all foreign and domestic enemies and reunited an empire that had seemed hopelessly lost. The Senate, fawning before his might, officially bestowed upon him the title he had already earned by right: Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. This moment was the pinnacle of his glory, but it also contained the seed of future tragedy. Having achieved absolute power, having become a living god in the eyes of his subjects, Aurelian ceased to be a mere man. He became a symbol, an institution. And symbols do not forgive mistakes, neither others nor their own. In this moment of triumph, reveling in his own greatness, he perhaps forgot that he ruled not gods or symbols, but people, driven by simple and often base passions. He stood at the top of the world, not noticing that the ground beneath his feet was already beginning to give way under the weight of the fear he himself had sown. Having restored the frontiers, Aurelian set about restoring internal order with the same iron resolve. One of the main problems was the completely ruined financial system. The coinage, especially the Antoninianus, had become so devalued that it was essentially worthless copper discs. The emperor decided to carry out a monetary reform, issuing a new, higher quality coin with a fixed silver content, marked with Gixdiogon or Ka, which, according to numismatists, meant a ratio of 20 parts copper to 1 part silver. This measure was intended to stabilize the economy and restore confidence in the currency. However, to carry out the reform, he needed to control the mints, especially the main one in Rome. And there, monstrous corruption reigned. The mint master, Felicissimus, and his workers had been enriching themselves for years by issuing counterfeit coins and debasing the alloy. When Aurelian tried to stop this practice, they started a revolt. This was not just a workers' strike, but a serious armed rebellion in the heart of the empire. The rebels, joined by disgruntled senators and the city's rabble, barricaded themselves on the Caelian hill. Aurelian had to storm his own capital. The suppression of the revolt was incredibly brutal. According to various sources, up to 7,000 people were killed. Aurelian spared no one, including several senators suspected of sympathizing with the rebels. This episode showed that his methods remained unchanged, regardless of whether his opponent was a Gothic warrior or a Roman citizen. He imposed order with the ruthlessness of a surgeon amputating a diseased limb. The reform was eventually implemented, and it did help to slow the economic collapse. But the price was high. Aurelian turned a part of the Roman elite against him and showed all officials of the empire, from the humblest clerk to the praetorian prefect, that under his rule, corruption or disobedience was not just a professional crime, but a mortal sin, punishable without trial or investigation. Around a figure of absolute rule like Aurelian, a particular type of court always forms. It was not a court in the classic sense, with its intrigues and struggles for the monarch's favor. It was a military headquarters, operating in a constant state of emergency. His closest associates were men like himself, from the Illyrian provinces, battle-tested generals, the future emperors, Probus, Carus, Diocletian. They were bound by a brotherhood of arms and a common goal, and their loyalty seemed absolute. But even they were not friends in the full sense of the word. They were subordinates, executors of his iron will. Below them stood the administrative apparatus, secretaries, notaries, treasurers. These men, unlike the generals, did not command legions. Their only tool was information, their only defense, the flawless execution of their duties. Aurelian, who despised paperwork but understood its importance, demanded the same discipline from them as from soldiers on parade. Any mistake in a report, any inaccuracy in calculations, any suspicion of embezzling funds could cost them their heads. In this atmosphere of total control and constant pressure, there was no room for trust. Relationships were built not on loyalty, but on fear. The secretary Eros, like other officials, walked a knife's edge every day. He saw the emperor send men to their deaths for the slightest offense without blinking. He understood that his own life depended on a single wrongly written letter, a single missed digit. This circle of fear, created by Aurelian himself as a tool for imposing order, had turned into a powder keg. All it needed was a single spark, one small mistake, one desperate lie, for the whole thing to explode, destroying the creator of the system along with it. He surrounded himself with men who feared him more than the enemy, and he failed to consider that fear is the most unreliable of allies. Aurelian understood that military and economic unity were not enough for the long-term stability of the empire. The disintegrating world needed a new, unifying idea, a new faith. Christianity was still a persecuted sect, and the old Roman gods had lost their relevance. The solution Aurelian found was brilliant in its simplicity and political foresight. He decided to make the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, the official state religion. This cult was not entirely new. It was already popular in the army, especially among soldiers from the east and the Danubian provinces. But Aurelian gave it a universal, all-encompassing character. The sun was a deity understandable to everyone, from a Syrian merchant to a Gallic peasant. It stood above all local gods. It gave life, light, and order. In 274, Aurelian consecrated a magnificent temple to the sun in Rome, declaring it the chief deity of the empire. The birthday of the sun, December 25th, became an official holiday. This move had profound symbolic meaning. Aurelian was not just introducing a new god, he was creating a theological justification for his own power. The emperor, who held the title Restitutor Orbis, became the earthly representative of the Restitutor Lucis, the restorer of light. He and the sun were two aspects of the same force, bringing order to a world of chaos. This reform was an attempt to create a kind of pagan monotheism that could unite the diverse population of the empire. But like all his reforms, it was imposed from above, by an iron will. By establishing the cult of a single god, he was, in essence, saying, "There is only one sun in the sky and only one ruler on earth." This further solidified his absolute, unlimited power, but it also raised the stakes for everyone around him. A mistake before a mere emperor was dangerous. A mistake before the living embodiment of a god was fatal. As his fame grew, so did his reputation as a merciless tyrant. Stories of his severity circulated throughout the empire, which, though perhaps exaggerated, accurately reflected the essence of his rule. Soldiers jokingly nicknamed him Hand on Hilt, Manu ad Ferrum, alluding to his readiness to draw his sword for any reason, no matter how trivial. It was said that he ordered his own nephew to be crucified for showing disrespect to his authority. Another story told that he had a soldier who seduced a comrade's wife tied to 2 bent trees, which, when released, tore him apart. It doesn't matter if these stories were true in every detail. What matters is that people believed them. His name became synonymous not only with order, but also with cruel, inescapable punishment. This reputation was his main weapon. Provincial governors were afraid to steal, knowing that retribution would be swift and terrible. Soldiers did not dare to mutiny. Enemies trembled at the mere mention of his name. But this weapon was double-edged. By creating the image of a ruler capable of any cruelty to maintain discipline, he made any lie about his cruelty plausible. When his officers saw their names on the forged list of those condemned to death, they would not have the slightest doubt about its authenticity. They would not think, Aurelian couldn't have ordered this. They would think, this is his style, he is capable of this. He himself, with his own hands, created the context in which the most absurd lie would be received as terrifying truth. His reputation, which helped him save the empire, ultimately became his death sentence. He fell victim not to a conspiracy, but to his own carefully crafted image. Even at the height of his power, Aurelian remained a pragmatist, capable of making difficult and unpopular decisions. One such decision was the final withdrawal of Roman troops from the province of Dacia, the territory of modern Romania, conquered by the Emperor Trajan a century and a half earlier. This gold-rich province, located beyond the natural frontier of the Danube, had become a constant headache. It was extremely difficult to defend from the raids of the Goths and Carpi, and it required vast military resources that the empire simply did not have. Aurelian realized that holding on to Dacia was an unaffordable luxury. In 271, he ordered the evacuation of all legions and civil administration from the province. To save face and not admit defeat, he made a clever move. On the southern bank of the Danube, within the old borders of the empire, he created a new province, which he also named Dacia, Dacia Aureliana, relocating part of the evacuated population there. It was a strategically sound, though painful, decision. He was sacrificing a part to save the whole. But in Rome, among the senatorial aristocracy, this step was seen as a humiliation, as Rome's first territorial retreat in many years. For them, raised on the idea of constant imperial expansion, voluntarily abandoning a province was a disgrace. This episode showed that despite all his victories, Aurelian remained an outsider to the Roman elite. He was a soldier who thought in terms of strategic expediency, not imperial prestige. He was willing to cut off a finger to save the hand. But this decision, like many others, only deepened his isolation. He was saving the empire, but he did so using methods that were alien and terrifying to many of its inhabitants, from the common clerk to the noble senator. Now let us return to that tent, to the man with the pen in his hand. Eros. Ancient sources give different names, Eros or Mukapor, but the essence remains the same. He was not an ambitious general dreaming of the throne, nor a bribed Persian spy. He was an ordinary bureaucrat, a cog in the vast military machine Aurelian had built. His world consisted of orders, reports, supply lists, and financial statements. His job demanded absolute precision and honesty. And it was in this world that he made his mistake. Historians debate its nature. Perhaps he was caught taking a small bribe. Perhaps he made a serious error in the paperwork that could have disrupted the army's supply lines for the upcoming Persian campaign. Or perhaps, as one version suggests, he simply lied to the emperor about some minor issue to protect himself and feared that this lie was about to be exposed. The specific reason is less important than the consequence. In any other system, under any other emperor, such an offense might have been punished with a fine, a demotion, or dismissal. But in Aurelian's system, Eros knew there would be only one punishment: death. He lived in constant daily terror of his master. He had seen his outbursts of rage, had seen heads roll for far lesser transgressions. This fear paralyzed his will, robbing him of the ability to think rationally. His only thought was survival, at any cost. And in his terror-inflamed mind, a monstrous yet ingenious plan was born. He couldn't kill the Emperor himself, but he could make others do it. He could use Aurelian's own primary tool of governance, fear, against him. The psychology of this future murderer is not that of a villain, but that of a cornered animal, ready to do anything to save its own skin. The fatal mistake had been made. There was no going back. Eros knew that sooner or later, the Emperor, who had a phenomenal memory and attention to detail, would discover the discrepancy in the papers or uncover the truth. The countdown on his life had begun. And so, in his desperation, he resolved to take his mad step. He took an official document, the seal of the Imperial Chancellery, and in his calligraphic script, which Aurelian so valued, he composed the list. It was an act of diabolical ingenuity, born of pure terror. Who should be on this list? If it contained only his personal enemies, it would arouse suspicion. No, the lie had to be as plausible as possible. And Eros made a brilliant decision. He included the names of the most high-ranking and loyal officers to Aurelian, his comrades in arms, the very men who had been through fire and water with him. But he also added another name to the list, his own. It was a masterful stroke. By including himself among the condemned, he transformed himself from a potential conspirator into just another victim, like all the rest. He made his lie irrefutable. Picture the scene, a trembling hand writing name after name, the names of men he saw every day, the names of the pillars of the regime. Each stroke of the pen was a death sentence issued by him. He understood he was setting in motion a mechanism he could no longer stop. This forgery was his only chance. He was betting everything, knowing that if his plan failed, a death far more agonizing than a simple execution awaited him. But if it worked, he would save his life. In that moment, the small, frightened clerk became a puppeteer, pulling the strings of the most powerful warriors in the Empire. Now came the hardest part, putting the plan into action. Eros began to operate with cunning and caution. He approached each officer on the list one by one in the strictest secrecy. He showed them the fatal document, his face a mask of horror and sympathy. "Look," he would whisper, "I accidentally saw this order on the Emperor's desk. He's going to execute all of us, me too. I don't know why. Maybe he's just decided to get rid of his old commanders before the new campaign, so all the glory will be his." His arguments hit their mark perfectly. Each of these battle-hardened veterans knew Aurelian's unforgiving nature. Each of them had likely committed minor offenses in the past that the Emperor might suddenly recall. The legends of his cruelty and suspicion made the news completely believable, and the presence of Eros's own name on the list, the trusted secretary, removed any final doubts. This couldn't be his scheme. He himself was among the doomed. Fear, like a contagious disease, began to spread through the camp. Men who would face death in battle without hesitation were now paralyzed with terror at the prospect of a cold, bureaucratic execution. They saw no other way out but to strike first. This was not a conspiracy for power or money. It was a conspiracy of desperation, an act of collective self-defense. Eros had masterfully played on their psychology. He did not call for murder. He merely showed them the proof of their imminent demise and let fear do the rest. Several powerful generals, united by a common terror, made their decision. They had to kill the Emperor before he killed them. The small lie, born from one man's cowardice, had become a death sentence for the restorer of the world. All of this was happening against the backdrop of preparations for a grand campaign. Aurelian, having united the empire, had decided to finally deal with Rome's last major enemy. Sasanian Persia. This was to be the crowning achievement of his career, a campaign that would place him alongside Trajan and Alexander the Great. He had assembled a huge army, the best legions, and was marching east. The atmosphere among the troops was ambivalent. On one hand, the soldiers believed in their invincible commander and anticipated rich spoils. On the other, the high command was already poisoned by Eros's lie. The conspirators marched with the emperor, dined with him, discussed plans for the future campaign, all while the cold glint of resolve hardened in their eyes. The scene was set in Thrace, near the small town of Kenofrurium, the last stop before crossing into Asia. What a monstrous irony. Aurelian, standing on the threshold of his greatest triumph, preparing to crush Rome's age-old enemy, was already a dead man who did not know his sentence had been passed. He looked eastward, toward the lands of Persia, failing to see that the mortal threat was right behind him, in his own tent, among those he trusted most. Fate, it seemed, was laughing at him. He, who had spent his entire life fighting external threats, was utterly defenseless against an internal one. A sense of doom hung in the air, but only the conspirators could feel it. For Aurelian himself, it was just another evening before another war, another step on the path to eternal glory. He did not know that this path would end here, on a dusty road in Thrace, short of the fields of battle. The end came suddenly, on a day in the autumn of 275. Aurelian, accompanied by a small group of his bodyguards and senior officers, rode out from the camp to inspect a road, or, according to another version, on some personal business. Among his escort were the conspirators. They chose a moment when the emperor was some distance from the main body of his guard. It was nothing like a battle. It was a vile, treacherous murder. One of the officers, a Praetorian prefect, suddenly struck. Aurelian, who was now 60 years old but still possessed formidable strength, tried to defend himself. He was a great warrior, but he could not single-handedly fight off several skilled assassins, his own best commanders. The short, fierce struggle was over quickly. The restorer of the world, the man who had defeated 3 empires and dozens of barbarian tribes, lay dead in the road dust, stabbed with the swords of those who had sworn allegiance to him just the day before. There was nothing heroic about it. No epic duel, no final speech. Just a crude, bloody murder committed out of fear. The lion, who feared no one and nothing, had been slain by his own pack, a pack that he himself had trained and driven to madness with his own roar. The tragedy of his death lay not in the fact of it. All emperors of that era died violently, but in its absolute senselessness and irony. He died not on the battlefield, not in a palace coup, but because of a clerical error and a panicked lie. The great epic of world restoration ended with a dirty, back-alley murder on the roadside of history. Immediately after the assassination, something happened that turned the tragedy into a complete absurdity. The assassins, having reached the emperor's personal archive in his tent, began searching for the very order for their execution to present as justification for their act. And of course they found nothing. They began to question the surviving secretaries, and at this point, Eros, realizing his own life hung by a thread, confessed everything. He told them that there was no order, that the entire list was a forgery he had concocted to save his own skin. The reaction of these battle-hardened generals is hard to imagine. It was shock, horror, and above all, a burning, irreparable sense of guilt. They realized they had made a monstrous mistake. They had killed not a tyrant who was about to destroy them, but their great commander, the savior of the empire, the only man who could have led them to victory in Persia. They had killed him because of a frightened clerk's lie. Their act, which in their eyes had been one of self-defense, was instantly transformed into a vile, unforgivable betrayal. The bitter dawn of truth was more terrible than any of Aurelian's wrath. They realized their hands were covered in innocent blood, the blood of the man to whom they owed everything. This moment, the moment of realizing the lie, is key to understanding the entire paradox. The murder of Aurelian brought his assassins neither power nor relief. It brought them only shame and the realization of their own folly. Eros's fate was sealed. The soldiers tore him to pieces on the spot, but it could no longer change anything. The great emperor was dead, and his death was the most bitter and absurd in the entire bloody history of Rome. The army's reaction to the news of the emperor's murder was completely unexpected by the conspirators. The soldiers, who had been terrified of Aurelian during his life, were overcome with genuine grief and rage after his death. They realized they had lost not just a stern commander, but a father, a protector, the guarantor of their victories and well-being. The legions refused to proclaim a new emperor from among the assassins. Moreover, they demanded that the Senate in Rome immediately deify Aurelian, to count him among the gods. It was an unprecedented event. The army, whose commanders had just murdered their leader, was now demanding divine honors for him. The conspirators found themselves completely isolated. No one supported them. For several months, while the army and the Senate argued over who would be the successor, the elderly Senator Tacitus eventually took the throne. The soldiers hunted down and killed, one by one, all those involved in the plot. Justice, or rather vengeance, was carried out by the very men in whose name the assassins had tried to justify themselves. This paradoxical forgiveness and subsequent deification was the height of tragic irony. The system Aurelian had built proved stronger than his murderers. The soldiers, raised by him in a spirit of iron discipline and loyalty to the idea of Rome, remained faithful to him even after death. They punished the traitors and maintained stability, preventing the empire from plunging back into the chaos of civil war. Aurelian, in death, proved more influential than his living assassins. His legacy, his spirit, continued to rule the army, which ultimately became his chief avenger. So how can we characterize the end of this great life? Aurelian was not defeated by an enemy army. He did not fall victim to an ambitious rival hungry for the throne. He was not overthrown by a popular uprising. He was killed by his own subordinates, his trusted officers, because of a forged document concocted by a petty clerk. In essence, it was death by bureaucracy. He was brought down not by military might, but by an administrative procedure carried to its absurd conclusion. The system he created, based on unquestioning obedience to written orders and a mortal fear of punishment for error, turned against him. Eros's lie worked only because it was presented as an official document, and because no one dared to question an order, no matter how monstrous, that came in the emperor's name. This is the ultimate irony for a man who relied on the sword his entire life and despised pen pushers. He defeated kings and usurpers on the battlefield, but was powerless against a single sheet of papyrus. His death revealed the vulnerability of any authoritarian system, no matter how perfect. When fear becomes the only language of communication between a ruler and his subordinates, all communication becomes distorted. People stop asking questions, stop thinking critically, and are ready to believe any lie as long as it confirms their worst fears. Aurelian fell victim not just to a lie, but to the culture of silent terror that he himself had cultivated. His end is an eternal reminder that an empire can be united with a sword, but it must be governed with a pen, and sometimes that pen proves sharper than any blade. Despite such an ignominious end, Aurelian's legacy proved far more durable than he did. He ruled for only 5 years, but in that short time, he accomplished a titanic work whose results were felt for decades. First, and most importantly, he physically saved the Roman Empire from complete collapse. If not for his victories, the world as we know it might be entirely different. Western civilization could have fallen 200 years earlier, leaving behind none of the foundation upon which medieval Europe was built. Second, he left behind tangible monuments. The Aurelian walls, which he built around Rome, still stand today, silent witnesses to that turbulent era. They protected the city for 1,500 years. Third, his administrative and economic reforms, though brutal, laid the groundwork for future stabilization. He halted hyperinflation and brought order to the finances. But his most important legacy was the creation of a model of rule that his great successor, Diocletian, would develop and perfect. The model of a rigid, centralized military monarchy, where the emperor is not the first among equals, but a divine lord and master, Dominus et Deus. Aurelian was, in effect, the forerunner of the Dominate era. He saved Rome, but the Rome he saved was no longer the old republic or even the Principate of Augustus. It was a new, more authoritarian, more militarized, and more bureaucratized empire. He was both the savior and the gravedigger of the old world, the last great conqueror and the first emperor of a new, harsher order. And so, we return to the central question posed at the beginning. How could a small lie destroy the restorer of the world? Having traced his entire journey, we can now give a comprehensive answer. The paradox of Aurelian is that his greatest strength was also his fatal weakness. His absolute, uncompromising, and brutal efficiency was the hammer with which he reforged the disintegrating empire. He demanded the impossible from himself and others, and that is precisely why he achieved the impossible. But this same hammer, while imposing order, also generated a pervasive fear. He created a system with no room for error, no place for forgiveness, no possibility for dialogue. His subordinates, from the highest generals to the lowest clerks, did not love or respect him in a human sense. They were terrified of him. And it was this fear that made Eros's lie not just possible, but completely plausible. The fake death list was accepted as truth, not because the conspirators were foolish, but because its content perfectly matched their perception of Aurelian. He was capable of such cruelty. He himself, with his reputation, with his hand on hilt, had authenticated the forgery. Thus, he was killed not by the lie itself, but by the atmosphere of total terror in which that lie was able to sprout and bear its poisonous fruit. He fell victim to his own system of governance. Absolute power, unbalanced by mercy, wisdom, and the ability to forgive, gave rise to absolute vulnerability to the most primitive human emotion, the fear for one's own life. The story of Aurelian is not just a tale of bygone days, of battles and political intrigues. It is an eternal parable about the nature of power, the price of order, and the tragedy of a leader who becomes a prisoner of his own greatness. It asks us a universal and uncomfortable question. Is it possible to save the world without destroying oneself and the very human values for which that world was supposedly saved? Aurelian saved Rome, but he did so at the cost of turning fear into the primary institution of the state. He restored unity, but destroyed any semblance of freedom and trust. His story shows that an order built solely on force and coercion is as brittle as glass. It can withstand the blows of external enemies, but it shatters from a single internal shock, from one small crack caused by a lie or desperation. The greatest lesson the restorer of the world teaches us is that a leader's true strength lies not in the ability to inspire fear, but in the capacity to inspire trust. Aurelian was a brilliant general and administrator, but a poor psychologist. He could command legions, but he did not understand human souls. And in the end, it was this lack of understanding, this blindness to simple human weaknesses and passions, that brought him, the savior of a civilization, to a pathetic and lonely end on a dusty road in Thrace, leaving us with the eternal reflection that even the greatest walls cannot protect from an enemy who is already inside.